everybody, it's your boy Gsluke here for our weekly course breakdown, this time for the Memorial Tournament. We're going to Jack's place, Muirfield Village, and in this video, we're going to go over everything you need to know about this week's tournament, including who's playing, the venue, of course, that'll be the core focus of this video, that being Muirfield Village. We'll talk about what to expect from the venue, how it plays, of course, the types of players that I expect to succeed this week, and some of the courses around the PGA Tour that are very similar to Muirfield Village that perhaps you can use as a little bit of a comparison. So by the end, whether you're a seasoned DFS bettor, somebody who's been in the golf industry for quite some time, or brand new to the space, you should expect to be completely prepared with all the knowledge you need for this week. First, a look back at what we saw with Sam Burns winning, which was absolutely ridiculous at the Charles Schwab Challenge. During my Sleeper Picks video, of course, I talked about how I had a weird inkling about Sam Burns this week. Of course, he was a core piece of my lineups on the DFS side. I played him in Jock Market. He was part of my prize picks card throughout the week. And even more so, I fired a live outright bet on him on Sunday, very similar to what I did with Justin Thomas at the PGA Championship, which, of course, when you have two of those late ads come through for a win 2 weeks in a row, I mean, first off, I feel like one of the luckier guys in the golf industry, but second off, just great sweats on Sunday, because from an outright perspective, I was kind of laying dead through the first 2 days, but early on into Sunday's round, I saw what Sam Burns was doing. I saw the charge that he was putting up on the leaderboard, and I had to invest there. So I got him at 32-1, ended up putting a few $100 on him, and boom, ended up being one of our bigger outright hits of the year. So was really glad to see that. Sam Burns was only one win less than Scotty Scheffler, so maybe he'll start to get the respect that he deserves. But in either circumstance, a great event last week, and frankly, a better field this week and an even better venue this week. So I'm expecting only improvement from here on out until the US Open. So a lot to talk about. Excited to talk about this week's event. Let's go ahead and hop right on in. We'll start with the field, which is 120 golfers, an invitational-like field for this week, and you're going to see pretty much everyone and anyone teeing it up. It's similar to the Players' Championship, where if you have status for this field, you're pretty much going to be teeing it up. So we have Jon Rahm, Patrick Cantlay, who have both had a ton of success around Muirfield Village, both teeing it up this week. Colin Morikawa, Jordan Spieth, and Victor Hovland will be making the trip from Fort Worth over to this week's golf course. We have Cam Smith, also Rory McIlroy making the trip over. So in terms of the studs, just numerous options. I mean, it's more notable the guys that won't be teeing it up, like a Dustin Johnson in this year's event, than the guys that are actually going to be there. So I won't bore you with all the details. Just know that it's going to be a star-studded event. In terms of the past winners, I mean, last year, of course, you had Patrick Cantlay at -13, but you could put a huge asterisk on that. Of course, Jon Rahm with the huge lead after Saturday ended up being disqualified due to having COVID, ended up having to withdraw there, and as a result, that's why I say there's an asterisk on it, because with that sort of lead, who would have known, the dynamic of the leaderboard, right? People would have had to be a lot more aggressive than they were before, and of course, Jon Rahm was extremely likely to win that event. So it was -13 last year, but probably would have been closer to -17 or -18 if Jon Rahm weren't had to withdraw. -9 the year before won it, and that was, of course, also Jon Rahm, which it was a more difficult year there in 2020. In 2019, it was Patrick Cantlay. You can see the recurring theme between Patrick Cantlay and Jon Rahm here, where he won at -19. Bryson won the year before that at -15. And back in 2017, we had Jason Duffner win at a score of -4. So that is, of course, the highest score of the bunch there at -4. And that was when the weather was its worst. So there was a lot of wind that year, also a little bit of rain, which on top of an already extremely difficult golf course, which we'll talk about here in a second, is going to lead to some high scoring. So in terms of conditions, you can see there's a wide variety there from -4 up to -19. But something to note is that in 2020, there was a massive renovation. So after the Cantlay year of -19, a lot was dug up. There's quite a few changes in the golf course. Those weren't all reflected until actually last year's golf tournament. A lot of them were finalized Last year, minus 13 was the first year that it was under quote unquote new tournament conditions. And most of the reliable data, at least for this year's event, is going to be pulled from last year. Now, the golf course isn't completely different than it was before. So the stats from 2019 to 2013 or wherever you're able to pull your shots gained metrics from are still going to be slightly relevant, but you should certainly be weighing this stuff from 2020 and 2021 a lot more than the years before that. So just understand that with some of the stat models that you're running. And we'll talk about some of the renovations here in a second as well. The cut lines was +2 in 2021. It was +3 in 2020. +1 the year before that, even, and then +3. So the range there from even par to +3. In 2018, the winner was just -15. So of course that wasn't the -19 year, and that was when it was even par. The year it was a -19 winner, you had a +1 cut line. So one of the middle numbers on the spectrum. It's not like it was super easy in terms of a cut line. So I just thought that was an interesting disparity there. So if I'm going to project a cut line here in the 2022 version, I'd put it in that 1 to 3 over par range. Now, one thing that I will say is that because we had the renovation a few years ago, one thing that Jack Nicklaus has already been quoted as saying is this year the greens are going to be fiery. That's the exact quote that he gave us. And if that's going to be the case, it'd err towards the more difficult side, right? So maybe in that +2 to +3 range. And in terms of winning score, probably something closer to -10 to -13. If at least Jack Nicklaus is somebody that we can hold to his word. All right, and now for the golf course. So it's Muirfield Village Golf Club. This is a Jack Nicklaus design. So him and his team have, of course, designed plenty of venues around the PGA Tour, but this was renovated heavily in 2020. So first off, want to start there. It was a lot shorter before the renovation. Now it's closer to a 7,500 yard golf course. In fact, 7,543 yards. You also had almost a complete renovation of the greens. All but just a handful were completely dug up, recontoured, new bent grass surfaces added in, all that sort of fun stuff. So that was done in 2020. Again, a lot of those changes haven't been completely finalized until this last year, which is what we saw in last year's iteration. And it's also just the general purpose of the renovation was to make it more difficult. Again, with that -19 winner, I can't imagine that Jack Nicklaus was all too thrilled with that. So a lot of the recontouring made greens a little bit more severe than they were in the past. The rough, I would expect it to be robust like we saw there in 2021. And of course, a lot of that added distance is always going to add a little bit of difficulty. And for the most part, you see that distance added on some of the longer par fours. The first hole, which was right around a 450 yard par 4, is playing closer to that 470, 480 yard range. And all the par 5s, a little bit more beefy as well. So it's strategically placed. A lot of the par 3s had some length to begin with. So a lot of the length wasn't really added in that department. It was added to the holes that needed that little bit of a boost there. So that was the renovation from 2020. This is a par 72 setup. So your usual 4 par 5s, 4 par 3s on the docket. Nothing too unusual from that front in a difficult golf course. So for a par 72, it is the most difficult that you're going to see. In fact, it plays to right around a stroke over par. In 2021, it played to a plus 0.97 stroke average over the 4 rounds, which for a par 72, and again, that's really important when you're looking at a scoring average, is ridiculously difficult. You have the 4 par 5s to score on. You should realistically have a few short par 4s on any golf course to go out there and take advantage of. So, for a par 70, a plus 0.97 scoring average makes a lot of sense. But for a par 72, that's when it starts to be outlandishly difficult. And this isn't even a golf course where the par 5s are, unreachable. They're all in that 550 to 580 yard range. None of them are going to be 3-shotters for the super long players. So even though they are reachable, the real defense of this golf course are the greens, which we're going to talk about in a detail here in just a second. But a ton of undulation. They tend to run extremely fast. You have a lot of rough at this golf course. It's a complete test. So if you were to just take a look at it per the numbers, not really take a deep dive into some of the key metrics here, you might think that this is a relatively straightforward test. Like if you just looked at the overhead mapping, that sort of thing on a Pro Visualizer, which we'll also do here in a few minutes, you'd probably think this is a cupcake, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. A lot of the hidden undulation on the fairways, on the greens, that's really what makes this place magical, and that's what makes a place like Augusta National magical, right? All of the creativity that goes into the shots there, a lot of the factors that you have to take into play there, like hanging lies, elevation change, all that sort of fun stuff. That is the exact same type of golf course that we have here with Muirfield Village. So obviously a lot of you have watched the Masters, even if you're new to golf, that sort of thing. It's going to be that same type of feel for this week's event. So let's talk about the greens. They are right around 5,000 square foot on average, which is about 500 to 1,000 square foot less than the average PGA Tour course. And they're going to run it right around 12s for the week. So for 12s, I'm talking about the stimp meter reading, and that is a measure of the green speeds. That is a little bit higher than the PGA Tour average, but like I said a little bit earlier, Jack Nicklaus intends to make these greens a little bit fiery. He was quoted as saying as much last week, and he was going to make this golf course a little bit more difficult, kind of, I guess, tune into the renovation, at least the purpose of the renovation, which was to beef up, make this golf course a little bit more defendable. And this time around, I'm expecting to see that, right? It's been a little bit dry in that area of the country there in the Midwest of the USA, there in Ohio. And if that holds up this week, there isn't any type of severe precipitation, you're going to be looking at a firm and fast golf course, which with the setup that Jack Nicklaus has there is going to be extremely difficult. So these 5,000 square foot greens that are running at right around 12, maybe a 13 on the stimp meter, like I said, are the main defense here. They're bent grass. They have a ton of severe undulation to them, but also a little bit of, I'd say, nuanced undulation where, you're dealing with double breakers on pretty much every single putt. And having experience on these greens, even though a lot of them have been torn up just 2 years ago, those 2 years of experience are going to be extremely valuable because at a golf course like Augusta National, the more and more rounds that you have around that track, the better and better your short game metrics get. It's literally been proven over time that the more and more rounds that you have is correlated to success at those type of venues. That is expected, maybe not the case yet at Muirfield Village, but over the years I'd expect a very similar effect. If there's a huge creativity factor, if there's a lot that goes into knowing the breaks on these greens, knowing where to miss a lot of your iron shots around these greens, then you're going to want to have experience around this track. So again, even though it's only been 2 years since the renovation, the guys that have played the last 2 years and that have had success over the last 2 years are certainly going to be in consideration. The green in regulation percentage was 61.4% around Muirfield last year, which was 6.8% below the tour average. So with the small targets, with them being firm and fast, they were a little bit harder to hit than most courses. The fairways are slightly larger than tour average. So with the greens being smaller, you do get a little bit of leniency with the off the tee play with slightly larger targets than what they're used to seeing. They are bent grass, much like the greens, and the fairway percentage, as you'd expect, slightly higher than average because of the size. It's at 70.2% in terms of fairway percentage, which is 4.2% the tour average. So off the tee play, maybe not the most difficult for hitting fairways, but when you miss fairways, oh boy, you're going to feel it. The rough here is among the most penal. In fact, it was the most penal rough in all of the 2021 season. If you missed, you had over a half stroke penalty. In fact, plus 0.51 shots per missed fairway last year in 2021. And that was only in the rough. That does not include penalty strokes. So when you're missing the fairways here, you're going to see a huge factor. And that's because you're dealing with 4-inch Kentucky bluegrass, ryegrass, and a fescue rough, which, of course, the bluegrass is the dominant rough out there. You have patches of that ryegrass, a little bit of fescue grass, which is even more gnarly, that can get out there to pretty much waist high at some points. So if you're missing fairways, you're going to be in a heap of trouble. That's one of the defenses that, of course, Nicklaus was going for with his design. And this year, accuracy is going to be king, right? So even though 70.2% of fairways are hit around Muirfield Village, you want to hit as many as you humanly can, because every time you miss them, again, it's pretty much going to be a half stroke difference. And if you're missing 8 fairways on a round, you're looking at a 4 shots gain difference just right there. So definitely got to be tuning into the off the tee play to have success around Muirfield. And the rough, like I said, that Kentucky bluegrass ryegrass fescue mix is nothing to mess around with. All right, on the screen, we've got the Pro Visualizer tool, and we're going to go hole by hole, break down Muirfield Village. So, like I said, a lot of the undulation, the stuff that really gives Muirfield its identity, we're not going to be able to see on this imagery, but we'll get an idea of some of the shots required around this venue. So, hole number 1 is a dogleg to the right, is 489 yards. Like I said, it was lengthened along with the renovation to make this no longer a handshake. I mean, it is a relatively large green. It is well protected in terms of its bunkering. And even though it is on a larger side for this golf course, it has a ton of slope to it. So you're not really going to get justice for this on what we can see on here, but there's tiers to it. There's a tier up here in the top left. Bottom right, there's a tier. There's a false front on the front edge. So depending on pin location, I mean, realistically, there's almost 3 separate greens here on their first hole. So it is one of the more difficult that you're going to find around this course. Hole 2 is 454 holes. It is one of the few holes that's relatively straightforward. It doesn't really dogleg too far to the left or to the right. The green is just about average in size. Not a ton of bunkering to speak of with just the 2 there, but like most holes, while it does seem a little bit inviting from the satellite side, when you're playing it, you actually get down there, you see all the slope at hand in the fairway and then on the green, it becomes a completely different story. Hole number 3 is a 389-yard par 4. It's not drivable. You can see there's no realistic place to go and try and go at the green, even for the longest hitters on tour. If you wanted to get really creative about it, you might try and lay up over towards the tee box over here to the left. But I believe Jordan Spieth did that at one point last year, which I thought was genius. He ended up making birdie there. For the people that lay up over here to the right, this isn't a joke of a hole either. I mean, this approach shot into the green, especially when the wind kicks up, can be extremely devilish. And I believe when Jordan Spieth laid up over here to the left, he was the only one in the field to make birdie that day. And David Feherty was losing his mind over it because he thought it was one of the worst decisions that he had seen all day. And Jordan Spieth was one of the only players to actually find success. So maybe more people will start to do that. But like I said, there's no realistic area to lay up at. This right here is not a fairway. This is a tee box right here, right? So just understand that it's a relatively small target to hit if you're going for it. And Jordan Spieth didn't end up hitting it on that tee box. He missed it. He was in the rough over there, still got away with it. So might be the strategy to go with. We'll have to see what players are thinking this time around. We have hole number 4. It's a long par 3, 200 yards. Plenty of undulation on these par 3s. So kind of similar to hole number 1, depending on where they put this pin location. I mean, you're looking at there being almost 3 or 4 different greens within the one green itself. So it is a beast, like pretty much every hole around this track. Hole 5, the first par 5, we'll have to talk about here. It's 544 yards, so it is reachable if you hit a solid drive in the fairway. You do have a creek to worry about if you end up running through. You can't really hit driver here because if you do, of course, you'd have to hit a sweeping slice around that corner there. And then, of course, you bring the creek into play, which is kind of unnecessary because even with a 3-wood off the tee, you're looking at a hybrid, maybe a 3-wood for some of the shortest hitters on tour into this green. So I'll show you what it looks like. There is water in play the whole way up the hole, so if you're going for the green, you are going to have to deal with that water hazard. But like it there, hole number 5, I like the aggressive strategy. A lot of the longer hitters will just bail out over here to the right, hit a chip onto the green, and get out of there with a birdie. So a hole that I think aggressive players are going to take advantage of. But in either circumstance, one of the few holes that you're certainly looking to make a birdie on. Hole 6 is 454 yards. The tee shot is one of the most straightforward in all of golf. It's right around 35 yards wide. There's hazards, but they're not really in play unless you miss rather wildly. Now, the approach shot a little bit more difficult. You're dealing with a relatively wide green, but it is relatively narrow, so it is hard to hold shots onto this firm surface, and there's plenty of undulation and complex little tiers to worry about. So, much like all the greens here, it looks a little bit inviting, but it is a little bit more difficult in practicality. Hole 7 is another par 5, nearly 600 yards, so the longer hitters should be able to get down in 2, but some of the shorter hitters might not have as much success doing so. The guys that lay up are just going to have a wedge into this green, and the reason why a lot of players won't go for it is this barranca up here, which again you can't really see a lot of the undulation or the elevation changes here on the satellite imagery, is not that inviting. You either get a downhill lie going down into the barranca or a severely uphill lie going into the green, if you're lucky, which you can get away with, right? If you're on the uphill, you'll probably hit a decent flop shot onto the green, get out of there with a birdie. But if you're on that downslope, you're dead. You're looking at a par at the best at that point. So a lot of people will lay up unless they have that elite distance and have the confidence to get it on the surface. Hole number 8 is a 200-yard par 3, kind of similar to the first par 3 we talked about. Relatively undulated green, plenty of protection in terms of bunkering. So just got to go up here, nut up, hit a really solid approach shot. Hopefully 2-putt get out with par. If you end up making birdie, you're gaining over a stroke to the field. Hole number 9 is 417 yards, one of the shortest par 4s that you're going to find around Muirfield Village. A wide open tee shot. You can see one of the larger fairways you're going to have around this venue. I expect most players to just lay up with a hybrid or even an iron off the tee and set up something like a 9-iron or a pitching wedge into this green. Now, the more aggressive you are, you can see the more and more this fairway pinches. So that's why I say that most players will lay back. And if you decide to take driver and take it the whole way down to the river, of course, there's some trees that come into play, and I don't really know how much you gain because this is a shot where ideally you'd like to have spin on it to control the ball. And if you get too close to this green, you're talking about a pitch shot rather than something like a full wedge shot where you can kind of control it with the spin. So depending on what strategy you prefer, you're going to see a few different strategies employed for hole number 9. Hole number 10 is a 471-yard par 4. So whether you're starting on hole 1 or hole 10, I'm not sure whether they're doing starts off of both 9s or everyone off of hole 1. But if you end up starting on hole 10, it's no joke. It's a relatively long hole. It does have that S shape to it. So the first shot demands something that goes from left to right. The second, a shot that goes from right to left. And one of the larger greens on property, but also very tiered. So like I said, kind of split up into 3 different tiers there. Hole 11 is a 589-yard par 5. It is a dogleg from right to left. To get here in 2, you got to be a real long hitter. You can see it's set up for a layup right now. The longer hitters will try to push it down here as far as humanly possible, but that does bring a penalty area to the left side in play. So a little bit more risky to go for that option, but if you push it down there a little bit further, you're looking at right around 260, 270 yards into this green. Maybe less than that if you're an elite level bomber. But this is a gettable hole, but most of the people are just going to lay up here, right? Most of them will lay up with a 3-wood, lay up into this range with something like a 4-iron, maybe even less than that for some of the medium tier players, and have 100 yards at most into this green, if not less. Something like 70, 80 yards that they can be aggressive with. So it is a birdie hole, but not really an eagle hole for most of these players. Hole 12 is 179 yards. It is the shortest par 3 on property. It does have water in place, so even though it is short, you're still going to see plenty of big scores here at the 12th hole, but in either circumstance, difficult, mostly because of that water that we have in play, and also with the bunkers at the front and the back of that green. If you miss here, of course, the water would be the biggest miss that you have, but if you miss over the green on this thin surface, you miss short of the green on this thin surface, depending on pin location, it's no guarantee to get down at 4, let alone a 5. I mean, just the surfaces here are just devilish at best. If you end up short-siding yourself, good luck, especially with some of the stuff that you'll see on Saturday and Sunday. Firm, fast greens, pin locations that are going to be set on sloped parts of these greens. You're going to see some carnage over the weekend. You see it every single year at the Memorial Tournament. Hole 13 is 455 yards, dogleg from right to the left. So in terms of the off the tee shot, it's relatively wide open if you lay up. Now it does pinch if you decide to be a little bit more aggressive down there. It is a straightforward hole if you can hit the fairway, but if you don't, this is a small target here. So I'm trying to hold the surface out of the rough is, a fool's errand at the very best. So it's certainly a hole that you have to drive the ball well on. Hole 14 is 360 yards. You're starting to get it in that drivable par 4 range, but there aren't going to be many players that go for it. In fact, if memory serves me right, only 1 to 2 did when they had it set up properly last year, and that's because of this water hazard. If you end up having a miss hit, you can end up hitting it short in the water, or of course, if you overcook it a little bit, add a little bit too much slice spin to it, you're going to end up with a water ball off the tee. So it is a risk-reward hole. It is a birdie hole for sure. If you end up laying up, just setting up a wedge. So interesting to see the strategy that players employ, kind of similar to the other quote-unquote drivable par 4 that we had on the front 9. And those are always some of my favorite holes to watch on TV. Hole 15 is a par 5, 534 yards. And this is the most reachable of the par 5s, but it also deals with a split fairway. So you can see up here, the fairway does end. You're dealing with, sorry, I'll have to fix that there. It does deal with a split fairway, and then you also do with the layup shot. You have to deal with another split fairway. So you have to be precise here, kind of have to have a strategy for it, which is either lay up off the tee, lay up again, set up a wedge shot, or be a little bit more aggressive, actually push it down into the rough there, and then try and push it over this other set of rough and penalty area in front of the green. So an interesting hole from a risk-reward standpoint. We'll have to see how players take apart that. Hole 16, a 200-yard par 3. You have the water hazard in play. This is the most difficult of the par 3s. And of course, the water has a lot to do with that, but also pin location. You have a lot to choose from. This front left is very devilish. Back left, of course, is the most difficult that they have to choose from. But even these right side pin locations aren't very simple either. Just a lot of undulation on these greens to deal with. So definitely a hole I have my eye on. Hole 17, 481 yards. It's a long par 4. You got plenty of fairway bunkers in play and also a heavily guarded green. It has plenty of undulation to it. Also a raised surface. So if you end up missing this green, there's a relatively large penalty for doing so. So hole 17 is a hard hole. Hopefully you get by with par. Move on to 18, which is no snack either. I mean, just a dogleg from left to right, a long par 4, plenty of fairway bunkers to the right. If you miss to the left, you're dealing with a creek, also some trees to worry about over there. And the shot into the green isn't much easier. I mean, first off, plenty of bunkers to guard it. One of the worst greens in the world to try and get a 2-putt on, particularly if in that 30 to 40 foot range. And in general, it's everything you'd expect a final hole to be, right? It's birdieable if you hit 2 perfect shots, but more often than not, you're going to be scrambling to make a par to go out there and secure a victory come Sunday. All right, we've seen the golf course. Now let's talk about the skill set for success around Muirfield Village, which you got to start with the approach play. You have so many long iron shots required around this venue. You're going to have to be skilled there. You know, you could see it in the hole-by-hole breakdown. The par 3s, all super long. The par 5s, if you want any chance of reaching in 2, you're talking about 230, 250-yard approach shots. And then, of course, the beastly par 4s that are in that 470 to 490-yard range, where there's 5 of them at the very least on the schedule each day, depending on their setup. So in general, I'm looking for approach players, particularly the guys that are solid with their long irons, which shouldn't be a surprise. It's typically here at number 1. At number 2, we have shots gained around the green, which might be a little bit more surprising. It's not typically the most important stat from week to week, but around this track, it's unbelievably important, and 2 reasons for that. First off, small targets, right? 5,000 square foot greens. They're firm and fast, so they're also a little bit harder to hit. Again, right around 7% less greens hit at this golf course than at other golf courses. But even more than that, the rough length. When you have that 4-inch bluegrass, any missed fairway is pretty much an automatic missed green. So getting up and down here, you're going to have to do it a lot more than other courses. And it's also more difficult. You have these firm and fast greens. They're running with a lot of speed. They have plenty of undulation to them as well. So when you're missing, you're talking about having to hit a very creative shot to get it in that 5 to 10 foot window, let alone something like 3 to 5 feet that you feel comfortable about. So in terms of, challenge around the green play is going to be there. So that's why it's there in the top 3. It's not my number 2 stat in terms of actual weighting, but in terms of relative weighting, compared to most weeks on the PGA Tour, shots gained around the green is a whole lot more important this week than it is in most. Next up, we have shots gained off the tee, which for this golf course specifically, I'm using it this year more than most. Last year, guy like John Rahm, Patrick Cantlay, Colin Morikawa, for example, all are among the leaders in shots gained off the tee, which is kind of a departure from things that we've seen in the past. Driving accuracy is a whole lot more important than distance here. So even though you have so many long irons, you saw that there's quite a few layup spots where you're going to be enticed to just hit a 3-wood off the tee. It's all about just getting it in the flat, in the short stuff, 270, 280 yards. There's not a ton of holes that call for that 320, 330 yard drive where, those bombers go out there and absolutely unleash on the thing. It's much more about just getting it out of the rough. So for me, I'm taking a look at shots gained off the tee, but it is certainly a lot larger emphasis on the accuracy over the distance component. The other key stats I'm looking at, number one would be course history. This is certainly a course history track. We have a huge sample size in terms of course history. I should say before the renovation, we have a huge sample size. But even with that, I'm looking at some of those past winners, but even more so the guys that have played since 2020, so the 2020 and 2021 versions of this event, I'm weighing a little bit more. Taking a look at shots gained putting on bent grass, of course, putting is always going to be a factor in the modeling. This week, maybe a little bit less than most, just because we've had so many winners that suck at putting. I mean, Jason Duffner, guys like Hideki Matsuyama. I mean, of course, Patrick Cantlay, a really solid putter, but John Rahm, right, somebody who should have won last year, won the year before that. I mean, he's been in an incredibly bad stretch of form with the flat stick. So you've seen quite a few players that maybe aren't the most consistent with the flat stick have success here. So it is going to be a part of the modeling. Of course, the numbers on bent grass, but not nearly as important as it was for something like we saw for the Charles Schwab Challenge. A few other stats I'm looking at, we're looking at shots gained approach from the rough, particularly for 3 to 4 inch rough like we're going to see this week. Shots gained at Nicklaus Designs. So a lot of our comp courses we'll talk about here in a second aren't Nicklaus Designs, but considering that his golf courses are typically second shot golf courses and always have a lot of undulation on the greens, I think there's a little bit of a comparison or a little bit of data that we can draw from there. Shots gained putting on fast greens, taking a look at that. Shots gained at major championships. Another way to take a look at, these more difficult tracks, 3-putt avoidance, and shots gained per the last 24 rounds. So, my fancy way of saying recent form. So those are a lot of the key stats that I'm looking at and that I'm including in my modeling for this week. All right, and now for the comp courses. And one thing I want to say before we hop into our top 3 is that all the Nicklaus Designs that we see on tour year in and year out, or I should say a few times over the PGA Tour schedule, like a PGA National, there's not that many to speak of. I mean, the Barracuda Championship is a Nicklaus Design. You have one of them on the American Express schedule. That would be the Nicklaus course that's in that schedule, right? The Nicklaus course. In either circumstance, taking a look at who's played well at those golf courses would make a lot of sense this week as well. And like I said, they're second shot golf courses. They tend to have relatively complex greens. So if you're able to score at those other venues, probably could see a little bit of a boost here as well. So that would be my extra comp course, or the aside that I wanted to go over at the beginning. But in terms of our number one comp, there's going to be East Lake Golf Club. It's a golf course with gnarly rough. You're talking about a golf course where you have to hit fairways. You have those small greens, a lot of undulation on them, and when you miss the greens, there's a huge penalty around the green. A lot of comps, especially from the tee to green perspective from the golf courses. So there's water in play at both venues. Similar rough length, like I kind of mentioned. So that is a comp I'm going with, particularly from the skill set perspective. Number 2 would be Copperhead course at Innisbrook. So that's the home of the Valspar Championship. That's a bent grass green golf course, a golf course where you have a similar difficulty off the tee in terms of the rough being there. Also a relatively long golf course. So you're looking at guys that are not just long off the tee, but also extremely accurate, and relatively small greens that maybe aren't as undulated as what we're going to see here at Muirfield Village, but running relatively fast. So some comps there to take from Copperhead. And lastly, Memorial Park Golf Course, which is down in Texas. So from, an area of the country perspective, most of these don't fit that. Of course, Georgia for East Lake, you have Florida for Copperhead over there in Naples, Memorial Park there in Texas. But Memorial Park, similar rough length. They have that 3.5 inch Bermuda, I believe it's Bermuda grass down there in Texas, might be bent grass. I'd have to double check on that. But in either circumstance, small greens, a lot of undulation at Memorial Park. That really blew us away the first time that we went there. And they're also extremely firm greens, which that's the real comp that I like for Memorial Park for this week is the firm undulated greens. I mean, that's the main defense of Memorial Park, and that's the main defense of this venue. So I like the skill set perspective there. And in terms of, how I'm weighing these, it's a lot of the Nicholas design stuff is like 35% of my comp courses. And then I'm using the rest of that 65% over these 3 courses. So usually we're taking a look at designers stuff anyways, maybe a little bit more so this time around. But these 3 tracks also very similar in terms of the shots that are required at the venues. All right, that's all I've got for the course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, let me know what you think the winning score is going to be down in the comments. I always love to hear from you guys. I personally think it's going to be 15 under par. You're going to see some slightly more difficult conditions, but you're talking about the world's best players, one of the best fields that we have all year. Somebody's taken this place low. Somebody's going to John Rahm this place for at least 2 or 3 of the days. So that's what I'm going with for sure. But go ahead and let me know your thoughts. And as per usual, we'll have you covered for DFS this week, prize picks, showdown, all that sort of fun stuff. So make sure to stay tuned for that content. If you're not already subscribed here, make sure you do so you don't miss any of that content. Make sure you smash the like button before you hop on out of here as well. Helps me with growing the channel. I appreciate all the support, guys. Really looking forward to this week. Anytime we go to Jack's place, we get such a strong field. Just a few weeks away from the U.S. Open, of course, we have the Memorial, then the RBC Canadian Open, and then the U.S. Open. Just great part of the schedule here. Major championship season. You can't beat it. And hopefully some of the top players here can have a solid week and start to get ramped up for that U.S. Open. So looking forward to that. Of course, going to have content for the U.S. Open here in a few weeks, so make sure to stay tuned for that. But best of luck with all of your lineups, all of your outright bets this week, and let's get this cash.